So good evening, everyone. I'm Sarah Tim, Manager of Education here at Maine Maritime Museum. So this evening's talk will introduce the 19th century painter Winslow Homer, a major figure in American art who pioneered the Realist movement by capturing real-life scenes of the American Civil War and American laborers. But later in his career, this New England artist moved to Prout's Neck, Maine, to establish his studio. So this lecture is part of a series of programs connected to the work of a contemporary artist, Zach Horn, whose current installation at Maine Maritime Museum, titled Looking for Winslow Homer, reflects the artist's journey of exploring his own emotional connections to the Maine coast by attempting and then failing to find the Maine coast preserved in Homer's seascapes. So tonight, we will learn more about Zach Horn's inspiration, Winslow Homer, and his attempts to capture the sea in paint. We'll hear the insights of Diana Greenwald, the Lunder Curator of American Art at the Smithsonian's Freer and Sackler galleries. Diana will introduce how the Maine coast shaped the final chapter of Homer's career. But first, a few notes on how to submit a question for the Q&A session at the end of the lecture. So at the bottom of your screen, you will find a Q&A tab. We invite you to click this tab and enter your questions throughout the talk at any time. We will be pulling from this collection of questions to moderate the Q&A at the end. And finally, if you recognize Diana's name, it may be because she served as the Curator of American Art at the Portland Museum of Art here in Maine for the last 6 years and served as the steward for Homer's Prout Neck studio. And she just transitioned to the Freer and Sackler this spring, so congratulations to Diana. And also welcome back to Maine virtually. So I thank you for your time and your knowledge tonight, and I welcome Diana for you to start sharing your screen.
Terrific. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Sarah, and for that lovely introduction. I want to thank Sarah for inviting me, as well as having the exciting opportunity to think a little bit around Homer in conjunction with Zach Horn's exhibition, Looking for Winslow Homer. Before we start, I want to affirm and acknowledge that we are occupying land inhabited by the Wabanaki peoples, including the Abenaki, Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations, who lived here and who have lived here for thousands of years before Europeans began arriving around 500 years ago. So the plan for this evening is to spend a little bit of time talking about Winslow Homer and how he gets himself to Maine, what is so enticing to him about this coastline. You'll see here on the left an image taken from the PMA's trove of wonderful publicity images of how beautiful Prout's Neck can be. Many of you probably know that personally. And an image of one of these wonderful late marine seascapes of Winslow Homer here on the right. What we'll do is think a little bit about how Homer gets here, then about how Homer applies a pretty radical new vantage point to images of the ocean and the sea. And then also think a little bit about the really complicated and fascinating relationship that Homer is able to visualize between the tension between a natural landscape and an unmitigated landscape and the human presence in that landscape. In preparing for the talk, I saw a quote where Zach had noted that as part of his inspiration, that what he really appreciated was that, quote, Homer focused on what he saw from the windows of his house on the cliff. Water, stone, mist, sky. They are peopleless, they are untamed nature. So I love this as a framing device for how we're going to look at this, both because that notion of the window and using Homer's entire studio as a frame for that landscape is something that I'm excited to talk to you about. As Sarah mentioned, as I'm the former steward of that space in Prout's Neck, and Homer constructs it in specific ways. But I also want to think about Zach's notion of these spaces as being peopleless and being untamed, because I think there's some interesting tensions there that Homer is able to tease out in these late seascapes. So what I want to do first is give you a sense of what the kind of prototypical and magnificent late seascape looked like. I selected one of many of these late seascapes over here on the right from the Clark Institute, but it gives you a sense of the power of the ocean that Homer was looking at when came to Maine first in 1884, the sustained relationship he had with that oceanscape in front of him on Prout's Neck, and the real power and virility that he saw in the ocean as it buffeted those very particular schist rocks that he encountered on that landscape. So this image, West Point, is of a particular space on the peninsula. You can walk the perimeter of Prout's Neck. You can be right there and see that particular vista. And it's exactly 15 minutes, Homer says, after the sunset. So he points us to a particular space and a particular time in this image. And I want to contrast it with what American audiences would have been seeing prototypically in a seascape before Homer really turns everything on its head. So what you're looking at on the left is Beacon Rock, Newport Harbor, from the middle of the century by another very famous landscape painter of the moment, John Frederick Kensett. So to juxtapose these two images, we're looking at the Atlantic coastline, the North Atlantic coastline, but we're looking at seemingly two very disparate kinds of ocean and kinds of interaction of a maritime moment. So for Kensett and for many of his ilk and for what the American audience was very used to, these are calm, quiet seas. These are seas that are populated with pleasure craft. They're often populated with maritime tradesmen or small figures that give you a sense of the kind of placidity of those spaces. You can see I don't know if you can see my cursor, but we've got a little guy in red who's doing some fishing for fun over here. This scene over here that Homer's giving us, not the type of scene where you'd take your fishing rod. So markedly different space and approach to what it means to look at a landscape and to what that landscape represents. And that has a lot to do with a change in audience that Homer is really marketing to. So Homer comes of age and becomes very popular amongst a cadre of patrons who are often urban dwellers. They are often businessmen. They are often folks who are feeling a little stifled by an urban environment, and they are looking to spaces that feel untrammeled, that feel wild, that feel more elemental in their connection to a kind of untamed natural space. And a lot of them look to places like Maine to begin to feel that connectedness again. And so Homer really capitalizes on that and begins to create landscapes with a much more gestural brushstroke. You can see here the way in which he's applying that white paint across those rocks to give you a real sense with the actual movement of his brush of how that water is jutting onto those rocks. He's creating just a much more muscular feeling encounter with that natural space. And he's putting us in much more proximate space to that energy. So kind of night and day between someone like Kensett, who's really the type of model for what was coming before Homer to what Homer presents for us in 1900. So I'm going to take us back a little bit to give us a sense of where Homer gets the notion to visit these untrammeled natural spaces and where he's encountering a lot of those folks who are purchasing his work in such large quantities. As Sarah mentioned, Homer comes of age as an illustrator during the Civil War, really makes his name as a painter doing fairly placid agricultural and agrarian scenes. But then in the 1870s, he starts going to the Adirondacks. Homer himself is a fisherman. He's also encountering many folks who are coming up there for the hunting and for the opportunities of being in that unspoiled natural wilderness that feels engulfing. So what you're seeing here on the left is huntsmen and dogs, and on the right here, an image from the Portland Museums of Art's wonderful watercolor collection of Winslow Homer's. Homer goes up there with this kind of group of men who become his patrons, but they really fall in love with this engulfing sense of nature and the proximity, the being really part of that environment in that wilderness. And they also come and kind of fall in love with the types of people who are taking them through that wilderness. So that's the figures of the guides who really seem to know these spaces inside and out. And these become kind of heroic figures for Homer. So You can see here on the left, the image is called The Guide, and it really feels like a wonderful tribute to this quiet man who's sitting in his boat with his oar coming out of the water. Homer using a wonderful scratching out technique to create those ripples that are just coming off of his oar, but really seemingly connected to that dark engulfing space. Homer's really just enamored of this type of figure and what it represents in that closeness to the natural world and the deep knowledge of those spaces. And his patrons similarly feel that proximity when they purchase his works. The other major reason we think that Homer falls in love with a particular landscape of Prout's Neck is that the year before he decides to come up here for good, he actually spends 18 months on the northeastern coast of England in a small fishing village called Cullercoats. And rather than your prototypical artist of the moment who goes to Europe and spends their time in London or in Paris, Homer decides to take himself off to this small coastal fishing village. And he falls in love with the landscape there. So you can see here that beautiful confluence of rocky coastline and ocean. Cullercoats is famous for these kind of very wide, long, expansive tides that come in and out. But he also falls in love with the type of figure who make their living off of that coastline. So there's small scale fishing industry there. So there are men who take these dories out during the day to do the fishing. But what really enraptures Homer, and some of my really favorite images of Homer's are that he really comes to understand the work of the women of these villages. And he really finds in them a monumentality and a stolidness that is just kind of wonderful. And for all of the horizontality of scenes like this, looking out to sea or inside the bar, the women often become these like beautifully resolute vertical lines. Homer will also often augment them with those beautiful just suggestions of red at their necks to alert us and draw us into their features. And they are often the ones who are really doing the kind of work of looking out to the ocean. And that's a practical thing. They're looking for the men, their husbands, brothers, or fathers who are doing the fishing work. They're anticipating that return so they can help bring in the fish and send it to market. But it's also kind of serving as that proxy viewership for us. We are also the viewers who are looking out at those scenes, and Homer, in the placement of them, often in the center of these compositions, allows us to really play that role with these beautifully kind of strong female presences. I love to, in the work inside the bar over here on the right, the way Homer also really physically connects the figure with her billowing apron to the work of the men that she's awaiting. So that sail really echoing the turn of her apron and her skirt. It's an attention to this kind of old-timey costume that these women were wearing, and that was romantic to a lot of painters at the moment, but it also does the work of really connecting these people to this landscape, and like the guides before them, becoming these figures that really represent something important to Homer. So people who live off of this landscape, who understand these tides, and who rely on them and live and die by them, very literally. Homer first makes a trip to Maine in 1875. It's one of my favorite facts that he and his family decide to accompany his younger brother Arthur on his honeymoon to Maine. So Arthur is coming for his romantic honeymoon, and the whole family comes along. And they decide that they really like Prout's Neck. You're seeing an image here on the left, a period map that gives you a sense of why it is called a neck, that very slender piece, and then it opens up into that head with all of that beautiful waterfront property. The Homers, by the early 1880s, have decided to purchase property here. So it's Homer's older brother Charles and his father who established the first homestead. You can see in some images here on the right of the Homer family, the Homer men in particular, who are on those iconic rocks and that coastline. They're here because it is beautiful and it is wild. They are also here because they are businessmen who understand a good opportunity when they see it, and who understand that patrons who are interested in Homer's canvases are also similarly interested in journeying to these spaces. So the Homers are actually really important in establishing the summer community that becomes Prout's Neck. And you can see here on the map, if you look, that C.S. Homer, that's Charles Homer, Homer's brother, and then W. Homer. So they've established themselves actually on that coastline. And Homer's brother builds himself this ample house called the Ark. He builds himself a small carriage house over here originally it was just on this side, but by 1884, Homer decides that he wants the carriage house for himself and he wants to live there full time. So he, with the architect John Calvin Stevens, moved the entire structure about 100 feet. So here it is within its new form. These are actually both images of it post its move. But he asks Stevens to create a piazza. He calls it a piazza, but essentially a second floor balcony. But otherwise, it really retains its character as a very modest, small scale home and studio. That's basically one room until Homer adds a painting studio in 1890. It's a little surprising given that Homer by this time is a quite well-established painter. And that he's giving up a quite fancy studio at the 10th Street Studio building in New York City to make this move. So it's partially the fulfillment of an ideal of this kind of rugged, hermetic artist who ensconces himself in wildness that was very appealing again to his patrons. And it's also, I think, Homer's always kind of understood as a little bit of a curmudgeon who doesn't love company. And so it's an opportunity for him to have a little bit of an escape on this coastline. So you can get a sense here that that notion of him as the hermit of Maine, the hermit of Prout's Neck, is partially true. So he really is giving himself space from a lot of his constituents, but he's also quite close to family, that the Ark stays very close by. And you can see here in the one image that Homer actually makes, rather than looking out on the coast, he's on the rocks looking back up at the studio. So here you see that second floor piazza. And interestingly and importantly, you also see these structures that really buttress Homer's life when he's on this coastline. But you do also get the sense of this house almost serving as a beacon out into that natural space and onto that vista of the ocean. So almost like a searchlight or an eye, really pushing Homer towards that ocean. And this is essentially what he was looking at when he walked out of his house through some grass across a walkway. He basically walked out onto the scene that is now weather beaten, which is a scene that he paints in 1894. That if you visit the PMA and get a chance to go to the studio, you essentially walk out onto that rocky outcropping. So this is what Homer sees, and he sees it with care and with specificity. So to the point where we invite visitors actually to take a postcard of Weatherbeaten and then to compare it to the scene that you're seeing outside. Because while Homer does do interesting things to jazz up the drama, he really is looking carefully at the quality of that schist rock, at what it means to form a gray or a brilliant white as that foam encroaches towards you. And he does this really interesting work of situating you on a low vantage point at that rock. So you get the sense of that burst of water as it hits those rocks, that wonderful and kind of chemical moment when the water itself sort of becomes mist and becomes part of that very moody, evocative gray sky in the evening. So Homer's seeing that day in and day out and visualizing it with such grace, but also with such economy of paint strokes. So the palette here is actually pretty limited, but he's able to conjure this with such specificity and really with such beauty. But the house itself is, as I said, very much constructed to push him outward and to push the public world away. So you can see here a view from the street of the studio. And when Homer creates his art studio, he importantly neglects to put any windows on that northern exposure, which is unusual for an artist because northern light is famously beautiful to paint by. But Homer also installs the sign that you see below this. It says snakes, snakes, mice, which is evidence of Homer's sense of humor. This was out in order to deter passersby, supposedly, from coming in. He also had a fence and a kitchen garden that would have basically separated him from the public. And this is a shot of the interior, again, just to give you a sense of the modesty of the interior of that space, and a shot of the window from that room here on the left, to give you a sense of how the architecture itself works to frame that landscape for Homer. So in his construction of this home, in his transmission of it from a carriage house to a home and studio, he's thinking with the geometry and with the composition, and actually even with the dimensions of many of his canvases. Also, in this wonderful, quirky way, Homer is in fact signing aspects of his interior spaces as he would a painting. So this is one of my favorite little details to show people as we're going through the studio. He's used an etching stylus, we think, to etch his name, Winslow, on the pane of glass itself. So it does begin, even in as a piece of architecture, to echo the way that a painting functions. He's signing the spaces. And here too, just another sense of that asymmetrical second floor balcony that extends around two sides of the house to allow Homer a way to frame that landscape, to encompass it and understand it in some instances, and to get, when you're up on the second floor, a sort of wider breadth, but still using those big brown beams that were iconic of the arts and crafts architecture of that moment, but really using them to frame those vistas and those landscapes as well. So the architecture that Homer works with John Calvin Stevens to create, part and parcel of how he then begins to package that landscape for his visitors and his viewers. So with those wonderful images of those stalwart color coats women in mind, I want to turn you now to some of the iconic images that Homer creates of the Maine coast. And also with a little, actually, no, I'm not embarrassed. I'm going to show you some of my favorites. And I love the way that Homer paints women. I always have. There's a solidity to them. There's a monumentality. There's a supposition actually that Homer, when he's in London for a couple weeks before he heads to color coats, that he spends some time, well, we know he went to the British Museum, but there's a supposition that he spent some time with Greco-Roman sculpture, that he saw the Parthenon friezes, the Elgin marbles. And I think you get a sense of that in the almost classical stances of some of these women that he creates. But because he's enamored of those color coats women, the way in which they kind of link the ocean and the landscape, the way they serve as that kind of proxy viewer, he takes those lessons into the work in Prout's Neck. And in some senses, he also really then pushes his technique even further. So the West Wind of 1891 that you see here on the left is almost a kind of masterclass in showing just how little variation in palette and how little a variation in brushwork can create and evoke a sense of a place. So this is all in these moody grays and browns. There's dark brown to give us the sense of these trees, those really kind of iconic junipers that are buffeted by the winds. But Homer uses those brushstrokes to send that wind laterally across this. Again, that sense of the billowing skirt becomes here this dress. She's holding on to her tam o' shanter. And then just the white of the white caps then becoming that mist and cloud and sky. It's a wonderful way in which Homer's able to create the mood and the feeling of isolation of being on that rough coastline at that moment. Another detail of this image that I just adore is the fact that Homer lofts his signature as well up on the top left. So you can see his signature here in red. but it is almost being buffeted by those winds too and flying off to the left. So everything about this is finding a way to evoke the sense of that scene and the feeling of being there. The Fisher Girl is another one that I love. I always understand this as being both that woman who's able to serve as that proxy viewer for us, but she's also in her posture, in her verticality, in the sense of her almost draping herself like a Greco-Roman robe, but instead in fishing nets, is showing us sort of how Homer values these figures and their connection to the landscape and their role as connectors between the ocean and the land. Fisher Girl is also kind of wonderfully vague in terms of its background. So we get these tones of gray that certainly give us the sense and enough to suggest that she is at an ocean side, the dots of blue at the middle left, giving us the suggestion of that oceanscape. But really everything else becomes kind of pure suggestion. But her resolute looking and her clear stance outward really gives us the sense that she's looking out to that ocean landscape. And Homer's really wonderful about embedding himself into the different communities that he's working in. So for the landscape and the people of Prouts, that means these fisherwomen. It also means going out for the run of herring. For those of you who are Mainers, you know this is an event. And Homer talks about in his diary, or in his letters, he's a fairly terse letter writer, but he talks about the herring run and being boated out as the herring are running and watching this process occur in situ. So again, rather than being a Kensett who is looking from way far away at a teeny tiny red figure or a teeny tiny sailboat bobbing gently on the waves, Homer is bringing himself to the action and invested in the work that's going on in these ocean spaces. So what you see here on the left is one of his sketches of the herring net. He makes a series of sketches. He then also makes a watercolor, and it then becomes this masterpiece that's now in the Art Institute of Chicago over here. But there's a real sense of valor, of sanctity in the work that these men are doing on this small boat. There's a physical connection that we can see between the ocean itself, the glint of these fish as they're getting hauled, and the hand of the fisherman himself. Homer also often doesn't visualize faces with specificity, so this kind of becomes an every fisherman. But he really seems to be invested in finding a visual language for how these men work and the strength required, but also the skill required to pull these nets and to get these fish at the exact right moment. So another instance in which Homer is really finding that drama, but also finding the way to connect people to that landscape, and the work of that landscape being something that he's really interested in. I'll just mention as well that that another thing that Homer really excels at and begins to do with a lot more deliberateness as he continues to mature as a painter during his time on the Maine coast is to divest his images of overt narrative. So for an image like Kensett's, there's not a lot of drama. There's not a lot of high stakes. What we're looking at is a beautiful landscape, and it's not raising our heart rates or making us anxious. And we know that the outcome of that day will likely be a lovely sunset. Homer increasingly creates images that evoke that tension between the contest of a human at work on that landscape, but don't leave us with any satisfactory conclusions as to whether the outcome of this contest is going to go in this person's favor or not. And it's that lack of narrative and that tension that he really becomes a master of exploiting. So in works like The Fog Warning, we see a fisherman here out on his dory with his oars above a really tempestuous sea. We see the tiny specter of his own ship over here on the far, far horizon. We see that enormous halibut that he's bagged, and we see him looking, we can't really tell what the expression is, but with pipe in his mouth, looking back at that schooner. And there's real uncertainty as to what the outcome of this is going to be ultimately, whether that sailor is going to make it, that fisherman is going to make it back to his home ship or not. Similarly, this work called Eight Bells gives us a sense of again, Homer's interest in the way in which men worked on the ocean. I love this because the PMA actually has Homer's octet that he clearly used as precedent in an image like this. We also know that Homer had a sou'wester, that type of hat that these men are wearing, that's out at the studio now. So these nautical instruments, these ways of using instrumentation to explore and navigate and locate one's position on the ocean are of interest to Homer. And this is as much about kind of looking at the ocean, being again kind of proxy observers, and understanding Homer's understanding of the skill that takes and what these men would have had to learn and be part of in their work on the ocean. So the other little subset that maybe because it's so warm tonight, that I want to spend a little bit of time on too are Homer's images of Prout's Neck at wintertime. And it's both because it gives you a real sense that Homer is not the tourist there just on the off seasons, that he really does spend some time hunkering down. He's also, of course, spending time in Cuba and the Caribbean, but he really does pay attention to what that landscape looks like in a very cold and much more desolate moment. But also because I think it gives us a sense of his, again, kind of toggling between an untrammeled wilderness and a wilderness that has traces of the human presence, and his own, I think, kind of understanding of the ways in which he's shaping that environment as a landowner, as part of a family that's parceling out pieces of Prout's Neck as real estate. So an image here called Sleigh Ride that shows a quiet evening with a couple of dark birds who are circling and a sleigh walk kind of rounding a bend, but that trail of the sleigh giving you that impression in the snow. And then this lovely image, Winter Coast from 1890, where you kind of have to look and be a little bit of a very close looker in order to notice, in fact, that this is not a pure landscape. That even though with all of the drama going on with this very, very menacing wave coming, we do in fact have a trapper here who is almost completely camouflaged in the landscape here within that kind of red, blue, brown, ochre palette. And so Homer's understanding of the human presence here as being at its best, I think, sort of ensconced and within that environment. Again, very similar to the guides that he loves so much from the Adirondacks, that knowledge of those spaces that allows you to look and feel and be part of it. A couple more because I couldn't help myself of these winterscapes. This lovely image from the Yale University Art Gallery that gives you two figures who are wearing furs and in an interesting way, not wearing their snowshoes. They've got their snowshoes by their hands, and they are doing that active looking that we've seen Homer present with the women in many of his images. But we also see them, because they're not wearing those snowshoes, they're not walking on the surface of this snowpack. They are actually sunk into it in a way that I think really, again, sort of cements them and embeds them in that vista as they look out onto this very turbulent sea. And another beautiful image from Worcester called Coast in Winter that I actually didn't notice as being touched by a human presence until we had it in our exhibition about Winslow Homer and Frederick Remington. So when this work came to the PMA and I looked at it closely, I noticed this beautiful suggestion of human footprints. So here we don't even get the proxy figure whatsoever, called staffage often, and we're talking about kind of classical landscape parlance. So that figure isn't there, but that subtle suggestion that it has been, and that invitation that that we could be, I think, is this wonderful way in which Homer situates us, grounds us, rather than having us stepped back, puts us into these wonderful landscapes and asks us to look out at that ocean in really novel and fantastic ways. The one thing that I will then kind of just conclude with is that that Homer, in addition to having these figures that leave these very slight presences and just kind of lightest touches into this landscape, late in his career, Homer also experiments with what it means to have animals actually serve in some way as proxy figures as well for us as viewers. This is an image called Foxhunt from 1893. It's Homer's first really monumental canvas. It's also his first to go into a museum collection. This is at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. And it's a wonderfully complicated image also when we think about Homer as refusing us that consummation of narrative. This is a fox who, like our figures in Below Zero, is sunk into some very deep snow. We can recognize this too as really Homer's backyard. And when you see the title Foxhunt, I think initially many people read this image as the fox being the one on the hunt. We're accustomed to thinking about the fox as predator. And we see him really with those bright red colors of his coat standing out against the bright white of that snow. But thinking and looking more closely at an image like this, we actually begin to notice that he's looking a little bit gaunt, that he is like those men in Sub-Zero. He's compacted that snow and is really pretty deep in it. And that he's the one who's looking with a good deal of anxiety out at that ocean, but also out at this very ominous set of ravens and crows who are coming up from the ocean itself. This group is called a murder of crows, and we actually then begin to kind of reorient our understanding of this image. As we see them approach, we understand, in fact, that they are the ones who are the predators. The fox is, in fact, the prey. And the way that Homer also provides those little dots of, we think, winterberry over here on the left, as the kind of bright red that may augur that future bloodshed. It's an image that takes on very different valences when we think about that impending violence, but also who the perpetrator of that might be. So those complicated power dynamics that shift and upend are really interesting when Homer gets to these images of the animal kingdom and of the wildlife that he's seeing in and around Prout's Neck. And very late in his career, we get a kind of culminating image as well of what it means to have that unseen human presence, but to have some of that implicit violence also really kind of actualized in images of the landscape. So I'm showing you here Wild Geese in Flight in the PMA's collection on the right, and an iconic image of Homer's from very late in his career, the year before his death, called Left and Right, here on the left. Homer begins his first oil painting, painting a sharpshooter during the Civil War. I think it's safe to say that that is something, that notion of having an eye trained for a victim far away is something that sticks with him and becomes an indelible part of how he thinks about vision and about an acquisitive space in the natural landscape. So that by the time he's nearing the end of his career, he's picturing, again, what look like images of pure wildlife. But when we take a step back, we understand that the action here has been promulgated by the shot from a hunter. So that these are birds who, in the case of Wild Geese in Flight, have been downed, or in Left and Right are in the process of going down. So it's the unseen human presence here. It's, again, the ambiguity of who that hunter is, whether we as viewer are kind of implicated in that act of violence, But it's Homer's understanding too, I think, of the power and the potential overreach of a human presence on a landscape like Prout's. So he's visualizing for us what the stakes are for that landscape, for the environment, and for the types of animals who live in those spaces. So just to conclude, I think I want to impress on you that Homer is, he's really unparalleled in his capacity to upend our conventions of what a seascape looks like and how it feels. He gathers his ammunition from time in the Adirondacks and from his experiences on the British coastline. And he leverages them through that very specific lens of the architecture of the studio that he creates to frame those views for himself and for his patrons, who respond enthusiastically to these wonderful, energetic images that really, I think, for ever after change the way that we understand a seascape and look at the Maine landscape. So it's a wonderful, I think, entree to then think about Zach's work and how he animates and moves these images. And I thank you very much for your time. I'm excited to take some questions if you have them. And I encourage you all to visit the studio.
Thank you so much, Diana. Yeah, that was fascinating, and I have lots of questions, but I want to get to the audience's questions first. And that first question I did get was, how can you visit the studio? So Diana just mentioned the Portland Museum of Art does own that studio, so they offer studio tours. So you can check out their website. They have information there at the portlandmuseum.org. If you want to check out his studio. So one of the first questions that I got was, if you're interested in art, you may know that the MFA in Boston has a Turner show going on right now. A kind of a great question, if there's any linkages between Turner, who's operating at the early 1800s, is Homer influenced in any way by that work or that legacy that Turner kind of left in this later half of the century?
You bet. Absolutely. And there's evidence too that when Homer went to the British Museum in his trip to England, that he actually requested Turner watercolors to take a peek at in the prints and drawings room. So we know, in fact, that Homer explicitly understands that Turner is someone who is also fundamentally upending what it means to look at these seascapes. And many of Turner's most important canvases, things like The Slave Ship, are in Boston, are touring the United States. So we don't have evidence because Homer is frustratingly terse in what he writes to people. But it is likely that Homer had seen those in person. He's, again, as I mentioned, he's not someone who spends that much time abroad, but these things, Turner's influence was transatlantic by that moment. And Turner is, as this astute patron is suggesting, absolutely someone who is taking to the extreme that kind of high drama that happens, and also the kind of vital human stakes of what it means to live off the ocean. And that kind of awfulness of what, in this case of slave ship, it means to essentially use humans as cargo in the transatlantic slave trade. So yes, Homer is aware of Turner, and that influence is important on Homer's understanding of how the dynamics of the ocean and that interaction with the human presence can work.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of comparing the influence of Turner, of the drama and the impact of the ocean, that for sure Turner kind of pioneered, but I'm really interested in that almost contrast of having seen the Turner show in Boston myself. They're really kind of talking about the narrative embedded in Turner's works, that he does tell a story using these seascapes in a different way for his time. And here Homer, influenced by, but is kind of taking out that narrative, as you say. So kind of again, upending, influenced by, but then also upending the representation of the sea.
Yeah, exactly.
And its uses, yeah. Great. So I have another question here. It's an interesting question that I haven't really thought about myself is, did Homer enjoy outdoor sporting pursuits? Definitely a thing of that society of the time, hunting, fishing, boating. And if so, where may have he been introduced to this, or where did he do it?
Yeah, absolutely. He was an avid fisherman. He fishes in the Adirondacks. He's a member of not one but two fishing clubs, the Northwoods Club being one of them in the Adirondacks. And some of Homer's most wonderful watercolors are actually basically kind of very true to life biological studies of the particulars of wonderful fish that he's caught. He goes to Florida to the prime fishing grounds down there as well. So he is someone who will travel to get his fishing in. We don't have evidence of him necessarily being a hunter, but he's obviously in and around it in spaces like the Northwoods Club and the guides who are taking the quote unquote sports out to that. Charles and his brother Charles and his father Charles are both fishermen, so he does come by that through a family connection. And actually, one of my favorite objects, I'm hoping you all will go to the studio, but Homer does his own kind of amateur attempt at mounting of two fish skins that we have on view at the studio. And someday later in my life, I will write an article about Homer and taxidermy. But there's a whole interesting sort of, he paints the surfaces of those fish skins. So they're trophies, but they're also art objects. They're really interesting. And there's another one that exists in the Northwoods. So yes, he's absolutely a fisherman. We've got a bunch of his gear as well. And yeah, he comes through the family.
I will absolutely read that article. That sounds awesome. Someone's mentioning, and yeah, great to, if you're interested in Homer, the Met in New York City also has a Homer show on view right now, Cross Current, so check that out. So I have another question. Were any of Homer's family members painters, or how did he learn to paint in the first place?
I love this question because it actually lets me talk about Homer's mother, Henrietta, who was a watercolorist. She was a botanical illustrator, and this was a pastime. She wasn't a professional artist, but she does beautiful and subtle watercolors of particular types of flowers, of particular species of birds. We've got some reproductions of them on view in the studio to give you a sense of that lineage. So I think that close looking to different types of plants and to animals really is residue from his mom. He's not trained formally as a painter, so he doesn't go through the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. It's something that he exploits very much. It's part of his quote unquote Americanness, is that he is self-taught. He spends a lot of time looking. He does spend some time in France in 1867. So it's not totally kind of sprung from nothing. But he learns by doing. He really does. He begins as an illustrator. He gets a commission to document the Civil War for Harper's Weekly. So a lot of what he learns really on the job, and then transitions from the Civil War reportage into work in oil on canvas.
Awesome. I have a question. Kind of earlier in your talk, you were talking about kind of the role of the patrons, not necessarily shaping the content, but like really, consuming the works that Homer's producing. And that, I think that was prior to when he came to Maine. So can you maybe, this is a two-parter, maybe speak to who those patrons were when he was in Maine and in the 1880s and 90s, but also with my maritime hat on, thinking about the role of the artists of this time period and really kind of advertising Maine, because it's right at the same time that steamship travel and that network is really making it possible to get to Maine and Acadia, the rise of the rusticators and these glamping, if you will. So yeah, of the best kind. So yeah, but also kind of, so the role of these artists kind of not beyond Homer, at the turn of the century too. But yeah, who were buying Homer's paintings, his seascapes?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I love your linkage there, Sarah, of the kind of bringing Maine into a commercial space, because it's always important to keep in mind that Homer he's renting a cottage and he's selling property on the coast of Maine. He is invested in the real estate market in a very real way, as is his family, at the same time that he is marketing these views. And Homer is, he's a savvy businessman. His letters are really 9/10 to Knoedler, his dealer in New York, about what is selling, about how they're selling it incorrectly, about how they need to move it to a different spot in the front window in order to get more patronage. He's thinking all the time about how these things are marketed. So the market for these really isn't in Maine. The market for these is New York and Boston. So he is painting them here and he's sending them off. And interestingly too, he's not always painting Maine when he's in Maine. So these images sell extremely well. And he actually also understands that you can get a watercolor out a heck of a lot quicker than a major oil. So when the market dictates that he's going to get, that those are rising in popularity, Homer will get you a spate of like group of watercolors. But he's also he's also painting images and finishing images of places all over the world, or all over, not the world, but all over the Atlantic coastline. So the one image we actually have of Homer, the one photograph of Homer working in his studio, he is working on the Gulf Stream, which is an image of an African-American fisherman in the Caribbean. So we know for a fact that Homer is working on Caribbean images, on Adirondack images, because you can see Hound and Hunter, another iconic Adirondack image in that photograph. So Maine is a space where he's looking with fidelity at those vistas, but he's also, it's his workshop. I mean, he moves out of New York. And his patrons are, they're businessmen in New York, they're businessmen in Boston. If you look at the accession information on a lot of the major collections of Homer, you see names like Thomas Clark, who was one of the great big amassers of Homer's work. The Clark Institute in Williamstown has this lovely cache because another side of that Clark family grouped these images. But one of the interesting things actually about working on that Homer Remington exhibition that I put up a couple of years ago at the Portland Museum was that the patron base for those two artists, even though seemingly like totally disparate in subject matter, it's the same group of elite East Coast businessmen who want like virile images of cowboys as want really energized and macho images of a crashing wave on a Maine coastline. So yeah, the patron base is actually there's a lot of overlap. And Homer is also in New York, he's a member of all the clubs he needs to be. He kind of hates the social aspect of it, but he's a member of the Century Club because that's where he's hobnobbing with the people who are going to purchase these images. So yeah, and he's savvy too about institutions, right? So so the fact that Pennsylvania Academy of Art purchases that image in 1893 it's a big deal, and it kind of instigates that that movement of his work into major museum collections.
Fascinating. The story behind the story. I have another question here. What are your thoughts about Homer's use of photography? And do you think it played a role in his seascapes?
Yeah, well, I would first I would send you to two wonderful colleagues at Bowdoin, Dana Bird and Frank Goodyear, who did a wonderful exhibition and wrote a catalog about explicitly that, Homer and photography. Bowdoin has the kind of big cache of photographs of Homer, but they also have one of the cameras that Homer owned. And interestingly, that foray to England had, for me, everything to do with understanding the coastline and finding those wonderful women. But I mean, it's there where he buys the camera equipment also. So it's an important space for advanced technologies in handheld and amateur photography. So we do have, we have the evidence that Homer is looking to photographs, that he's in some instances drawing from photographs. I think what I love is what Homer's also, as a painter, Homer is doing what is kind of impossible in a photograph, which is to kind of capture that texture and that sense of motion, like with the strokes of paint. So I think he's intimately aware of what a camera can capture, but also uniquely capable of providing us with what a camera never will. So yes, it's an important aspect of his practice, and it's one that that's been explored in really beautiful ways.
Yeah, and then one of the last questions I have here from Deborah. I guess my question, I didn't know he lived at a lighthouse at Eastern Point Light. If that's true. Yeah, I haven't heard that. So if you know anything about that context.
I don't.
Yeah,
There's a painting called Eastern Point, but I do not know about him having lived there.
That would be interesting to find out more. Yeah, so thank you everyone for your questions. To end on, I think, a summary note that Diana mentioned is a great connection back to the Zach Korn exhibit and what it's trying to do, and just this idea of upending conventions of a seascape, right? So Homer did it in the 1880s, the 1890s. Zach Korn is doing it again in ways that may be confusing or interesting or intriguing, but make you think. So I encourage you to come to Maine Maritime Museum, check out Zach Korn's Looking for Winslow Homer exhibit. It is on view through October. And make you question your relationship to the sea, just like Homer and Zach does. So thank you, Diana. I appreciate it. This was fascinating. Again, I will read that article. I could listen to you talk all night, but I'll recognize everyone's time and let you get to dinner. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you.
Having me.